Excellences, chers collègues, la
dear colleagues,
9744e
the
séance du Conseil de sécurité est
9744th
ouverte.
meeting of the Security Council is called to order.
En entame, je voudrais rappeler que le Conseil de sécurité est un lieu de respect et je prie tous les intervenants et intervenantes de respecter les normes appropriées en matière de ton, de formulation et de contenu dans leurs remarques. Je rappelle également que le Conseil encourage en règle générale tous les participantes et participants, aussi bien membres que non membres, à faire leur déclaration en 5 minutes ou moins. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est la situation au Moyen-Orient, y compris la question palestinienne. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les représentants d'Israël, de la Mauritanie et de la Turquie à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Je propose que, conformément aux dispositions de son règlement intérieur provisoire et à la pratique établie en la matière, le Conseil invite l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies à participer à la présente séance. Puisqu'il n'y a pas d'objection, il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les intervenantes et intervenants suivants à participer à la présente séance. Monsieur Philippe Lazzarini, commissaire général de l'Office de secours et de travaux des Nations Unies pour les réfugiés de Palestine dans le Proche-Orient. Et Madame Lisa Doughton, directrice de la division du financement et des partenariats du Bureau de la coordination des affaires humanitaires. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Et j'ai le plaisir de donner la parole à M. Philippe Lazzarini. Vous avez la parole.
Madame la Présidente, Excellencies, I deeply regret that 1 year after the abhorrent attacks against Israel and the catastrophic war on Gaza, no end is in sight to the brutal violence engulfing the region. It has been a year of profound loss and suffering, a year of dehumanization and barbarism. Hostages taken from Israel remain captive, the family left in deep and prolonged distress. Gaza is unrecognizable, a sea of rubble, a graveyard for tens of thousands of people, including far too many children. Almost the entire population is displaced. People have been forced to flee multiple times, searching for safety that does not exist. The latest development in the north are especially alarming. Hundreds of thousands of people are again being pushed to move to the south when living conditions are intolerable. And yet, again, Gazans are teetering on the edge of a man-made famine. Children in Gaza have not been spared. They are killed, injured, and orphaned in shocking numbers. More than 650,000 children are out of school, deeply traumatized and living in the rubble. They have already lost 2 years of learning. Palestinians are no strangers to loss, but to be dispossessed from education, which has always been a source of pride, is new. We cannot afford to lose an entire generation and sow the seeds for future hatred and extremism. That is why UNRWA, beyond its life-saving operations, has resumed some learning activities in Gaza. Every day, we provide psychosocial services to thousands of children. We build on these activities to help them read, write, and do some basic arithmetic. Bringing children back to learning should be a collective and urgent priority. UNRWA has also played a critical role in an emergency vaccination campaign against polio, which has returned to Gaza 25 years after eradication. Together with WHO and UNICEF, UNRWA vaccinated more than 500,000 children during short pauses in military activities. The second round of the campaign is planned for mid-October. We hope to succeed again. For this, we need sufficient political will. Madam President, beyond Gaza, the West Bank is gripped by escalating violence. Nearly 700 people have been killed in the past year, among them more than 160 children. Civilian life is increasingly militarized, and settlement activity is expanding aggressively. The Israeli security forces routinely destroy public infrastructure during military operation, inflicting collective punishment on Palestinians. Lebanon is the latest casualty of this widening conflict. Civilians are paying a heavy price. Airstrikes by Israel forces are killing and injuring thousands and displacing hundreds of thousands, while Hezbollah continues to attack Israel with rockets. UNRWA has opened 11 shelters in Lebanon, hosting more than 4,500 Lebanese, Palestinian, and Syrian displaced persons. The need for the agency services in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, and Lebanon has never been greater, and we have never been under fiercer attack. Excellencies, the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and the near total breakdown of civil order is crippling the humanitarian response in Gaza. Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world for aid workers. 226 UNRWA personnel have been killed in 12 months. United Nations premises, including 2/3 of UNRWA buildings, have been damaged or destroyed. Our premises have also been used for military purposes by Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas and the Israeli security forces. Humanitarian aid convoys are looted by armed gangs and obstructed by Israeli soldiers, defining their own chain of command. Without a lasting ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages and unfettered humanitarian access, the aid operation will collapse, plunging 2 million people into chaos. In the broader occupied Palestinian territory, the agency's operational space is shrinking. Senior Israeli officials have described destroying UNRWA as a war goal. Legislation to end our operation is ready for final adoption by the Israeli Knesset. It seeks to ban UNRWA's presence and operation in the territory of Israel, revoking its privileges and immunities in violation of international law. If the bills are adopted, the consequences will be severe. Operationally, the entire humanitarian response in Gaza, which rests on UNRWA infrastructure, may disintegrate. Coordination with Israel would cease, further disrupting the provision of shelters, food, and healthcare to people in desperate needs as winter approaches. More than 650,000 children would lose any hope of resuming their education, and an entire generation would be sacrificed. In the West Bank, the delivery of education, primary health care, and emergency aid to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees would grind to a halt. Legally, the Knesset legislation violates Israel's obligation under the United Nations Charter and international law. It defies the will of the international community expressed through General Assembly Resolution 302 on UNRWA and deepens violation recognized by the International Court of Justice. Politically, the anti-UNRWA legislation, which is part of a broader campaign to dismantle the agency, seeks to strip Palestinians from their refugee status and change unilaterally the parameters for a future political solution. Madam President, these attacks set a grave precedent for other conflict situations when government might wish to eliminate an inconvenient United Nations presence. They target not just UNRWA, but any individual or entity calling for compliance with international law and peaceful political solution. Failing to push back against attempts to intimidate and undermine the United Nations in the occupied Palestinian territory will eventually compromise humanitarian and human rights work worldwide. This Council must decide to which extent it will tolerate acts that strike at the heart of multilateralism and compromise international peace and security. The climate of impunity that prevails will not dissipate without decisive action. We can uphold the UN Charter and enforce international law, including the Geneva Conventions and the decision of international courts, without exception, or we can concede that the post-World II rules-based international order is at an end. The devastation of the past year should pull us back from the brink of creating dangerous new norms of warfare and reneging on our decades-long commitment to Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is an integral part of the United Nations, which anchors the multilateral system. I urge you to shield this UN agency from efforts to end its mandate arbitrarily and prematurely in the absence of a long-promised political solution. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur Lazzarini de son exposé.
I thank Mr. Lazzarini for his briefing.
Je donne maintenant la parole
And I now give the floor to Madame Lisa Doughton.
Vous avez la parole.
You have the floor.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for this opportunity to update you on the humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, both in Gaza and the West Bank. This past year has brought unimaginable suffering. It's been 1 year since a horrendous attack by Hamas and other armed groups in Israel, and rockets continue to be fired indiscriminately into Israel. Few times in recent history have we witnessed suffering and destruction of the size, scale, and scope that we see in Gaza. In the past year, this Council has been briefed repeatedly on the horror unfolding in Gaza, at least monthly on average. Once again, we find ourselves at a critical juncture. Unfortunately, much of what I'm about to say mirrors what we reported a month ago. Widespread suffering persists while the humanitarian situation worsens. The recent evacuation orders by Israeli authorities for large areas of northern Gaza, along with intensified ground operations, risk more death, destruction, and yet another mass displacement of civilians. Once again, utter chaos ensues as the world watches on. Before we turn to the situation, we express deep concern about the ongoing legislation to stop the activities of UNRWA. This would be disastrous for the provision of aid and essential services to millions of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Nearly every one of the more than 2 million people in Gaza receives some form of aid or service provision from UNRWA, along with nearly 1 million Palestine refugees in the West Bank. If approved, such legislation would diametrically be opposed to the UN Charter and in violation of Israel's obligations under international law. Madam President, over the past year, relentless Israeli-issued displacement orders have affected almost 84% of Gaza's territory. Around 90% of Gaza's population is internally displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people are pressured to move south to al-Mawasi, but southern Gaza can't accommodate more people. In al-Mawasi, where civilians were told to go, 12 Palestinians were reportedly killed and at least 26 others injured when 2 tents were struck in the camp at Al-Mawazi on 1 October. Evacuation orders are meant to protect civilians, but the exact opposite is happening. As we've said so many times, there's no safe place in Gaza. 3 of the 10 partially functional hospitals in the north have been ordered to evacuate all patients without providing alternatives for relocating them. We've not been able to get fuel to other hospitals in the north. There's been no electricity since October last year. Without electricity or fuel for the generators, everything shuts down: medical facilities, water, sanitation, and other essential services. And bakeries are closing, deepening the already high levels of food insecurity. As this conflict persists, civilians must have the essentials for their survival. They must be allowed to seek protection. Those displaced must be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return. Madam President, severe impediments on the entry of essential commercial supplies and humanitarian access continue. For instance, in September, humanitarian workers spent a total of 212 hours, that's nearly 9 days worth of waiting, to receive a green light from Israeli authorities to undertake life-saving missions. And in the past week, there have been no humanitarian movements to the north, while both land crossings have been closed for supplies entering Zikim and Erez. The north of Gaza has been cut off, putting at risk the second round of the polio vaccination campaign scheduled for mid-October. Further, essential commercial supplies entering Gaza have drastically reduced in the past week. In recent days, on average, 50 truckloads of goods enter each day, quantities that do not begin to meet the needs. Humanitarian assistance cannot be a substitute for the flow of commercial goods, and vice versa. Aid workers are only able to deliver a trickle of humanitarian aid through Israeli checkpoints. These are life-threatening restrictions. People are traumatized, hungry, digging with their bare hands in rubble for their loved ones. They're increasingly frustrated about the international community's failure to stop the hostilities. And as the situation worsens, this anger is increasingly being directed at humanitarian workers. The lack of adequate humanitarian access means that food insecurity and diseases are spreading fast. The severe lack of shelter supplies is likely to worsen health conditions and further undermine the dignity of vulnerable populations, potentially leading to life-threatening conditions this coming winter. Humanitarian partners report that women and children are hard hit by the trauma of this war. Each day, according to UNRWA, 10 children are losing one or both of their legs. Gaza is home to the largest cohort of child amputees in modern history. Women are 3 times more likely to miscarry and 3 times more likely to die from childbirth. And yet, humanitarians are not giving up. Madam President, we also remain deeply concerned about the worsening situation in the West Bank. Over the past year, Israeli military operations, along with the rampant settler violence and house demolitions, have led to a sharp rise in fatalities, widespread destruction, and forced displacement. Just last week, on 4 October, 18 Palestinians, including women and children, were killed in an airstrike on a residential building in Tulkarm refugee camp. This was the single deadliest incident carried out by Israeli forces in the West Bank since OCHA began systematically documenting casualties in 2005. In the West Bank, the use of lethal force must comply with international human rights law and standards governing law enforcement. Tactics typically used during hostilities and armed conflict raise concerns about the excessive use of force. We urge full respect for international law and compliance with the determinations of the International Court of Justice. Maximum influence must be exerted to alleviate the suffering of civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory. We cannot claim ignorance to what is happening, nor can we afford to look away. That is why we repeat our calls for the Security Council and member states to take action. This includes ensuring respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law by exerting necessary pressure and cooperating and pursuing accountability for international crimes. This means ensuring that all hostages are released. This means ensuring civilians are protected and their essential needs for survival met wherever they are, whether they can evacuate or not. This means ensuring that humanitarian operations are protected and facilitated. including in accordance with the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice for all civilians in need. Urgent diplomatic efforts are needed to de-escalate the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory and to prevent a wider regional descent into bloodshed. Member states must take steps to achieve an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and a path towards sustainable peace. These atrocities must end. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame Doughton de
I
son
thank
exposé.
Madame Doughton
Et je
for
donne
her
maintenant la
briefing,
parole aux membres
and
du
I now
Conseil
give the
qui
floor
souhaitent
to
faire
members
une
of the Council
déclaration.
who would like to make a statement.
Et je donne la
And I
parole
give
au
the floor to
représentant
the
de l'Algérie.
representative of Algeria.
Madam President, I would like to express my gratitude to the Swiss presidency for swiftly organizing this meeting at the request of Slovenia and my own country, Algeria. I also thank Mr. Philippe Lazzarini and Mrs. Lisa Doughton for their briefings. These briefings highlight the horrifying consequences of a merciless Israeli war machine that has spared no one in Gaza. It is now extending its brutality into Lebanon. Madam President, massacres and killings have tragically become a daily reality in Gaza, and they continued unabated. In Gaza, over 42,000 people have been killed, 60% of them women and children, and nearly 100,000 people have been injured, some of them handicapped for their whole life. Shockingly, 6% of Gaza's population has been killed or wounded in the past year alone. In Gaza, the Israeli military has annihilated 900 families, erasing them entirely from the civil registry. In Gaza, at least 17,000 children are unaccompanied, definitely separated from their parents. They represent almost 1% of the 2 million displaced people, nearly the entire population of Gaza. In Gaza, 60% of buildings and infrastructure have been destroyed. Gaza cities now resemble ghost towns, apocalyptic scenes that are horrifyingly real. This is not a military operation against Palestinian military faction, Palestinian terrorists. This is a war against the Palestinian people themselves. As the situation is the West Bank, and the situation in the West Bank is not better, with continuing illegal settlement activity and unprecedented annexation of Palestinian land. Last year, was also the deadliest in the West Bank since the Second Intifada in the beginning of this century. The Israeli occupying power. The Israeli occupying power's aim is clear: to push Palestinians out of their homeland, following the sinister goal of no Palestinian west of the Jordan. Madam President, yesterday, the Israeli military threatened to forcibly remove patients, displaced persons, medical staff from Kamal Adwan Hospital, from Al Auda Hospital, and from Indonesian hospital in northern Gaza. This comes in the context of the brutal military campaign the Israelis are waging against the Palestinian people in northern Gaza. This is a blatant violation of international law, of international humanitarian law, and it is a criminal attempt to implement the displacement plans pursued by the occupying authorities. It is how international humanitarian law treat patient and medical personnel. Is it the protection afforded under the Geneva Convention? The longer the international community turns a blind eye and remains silent in the face of these crimes, the more the Israelis' tyranny and arrogance grow. Silence has become more than mere complicity. It is now an active participation in this crime. As we witness this barbarity, we must acknowledge that it is a glimpse into the future, a future war devoid of morality, a future war devoid of humanity, a future war devoid of international norms. As this Security Council failed to hold the Israeli occupier accountable, it became emboldened, believing itself to be above the law. Those who remained silent or try to justify today cannot claim to defend the rule of law tomorrow, because there will be no law except the law of the jungle. Madam President, despite the immense suffering, the occupying power is not satisfied with the immediate devastation of Palestinian land. They seek to kill slowly the Palestinians in Gaza through famine, through starvation. They have tightened the blockade, restricting humanitarian aid. In September, according to the figures of the United Nations, only 52 trucks entered Gaza per day. They were more than 500 before October last year. And these 52 trucks are the lowest rate since last November. Meanwhile, 96% of the population in Gaza faces crisis or worse level of food insecurity. This is a deliberate act. And the success of the polio vaccination campaign in Gaza demonstrate that when the occupying power commits, scaling up humanitarian effort becomes possible. The Special Rapporteur on the right of food, Madam President, his name is Mr. Michael Fakhri. In his report to the Human Rights Council, detailed how Israel has weaponized starvation as part of its genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people. UN Security Council resolutions clearly prohibit starvation as a method of warfare. It is a war crime, and this council must act what remains of its credibility. It is time to impose a ceasefire in Gaza. Madam President, amidst this catastrophe, the occupier has not spared humanitarian personnel. 222 UNRWA staff members have been killed. Two-thirds of UNRWA premises have been destroyed or damaged. Moreover, the occupiers advanced bills halting UNRWA operation. UNRWA, the witness of the failure of the international community to uphold the right of the Palestinians. UNRWA, the backbone of humanitarian action in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza. For years, the Israeli authorities has made clear its desire, its will to dismantle UNRWA because it symbolizes the Palestinian refugee and their inalienable rights. We reiterate that the rights of Palestinian refugees are not subject to statutes of limitation and are guaranteed by the international law, which cannot be tailored to fit the occupier's agenda. The fate of the refugees must be and will be decided by themselves, not by the Israeli occupying power. Madam President, to conclude, military force will not bring security, will not bring stability. The occupation will not last. Security in the Middle East can only be reached through achieving the Palestinian people's right and ending the occupation of Arab lands. The Council, the Security Council, should endeavor to make this goal a reality. If we do not act now. The Middle East will be engulfed in an unprecedented war. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Algérie et
I thank the representative of Algeria, and I now invite the representative of Slovenia to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also want to thank Commissioner General, Mr. Lazzarini, as well as Director Doughton, for their briefings, sober as always, and nothing else was actually expected. Thank you very much. A year ago, we woke up to shocking news from Israel. Events left us in confusion and took us days to understand. I take this opportunity to once again firmly condemn the terrorist attacks of 7th of October and the taking of hostages. Slovenia is outraged by the terror committed on that day by Hamas. Our thoughts have been with hostages and their families every day for the past year. These days, we feel their pain even more. What unfolded in the days, weeks, and months after in Gaza is, however, equally shocking. We fail to understand how Israeli response to a terrorist attack can result in indiscriminate collateral killing of over 40,000 civilians, most among them women and children. We firmly believe the international community must do better in its response to such atrocities. Colleagues, over the recent months, this Council has spent countless hours in briefings, assessments of situation, and debates about possible solutions. Our calls for respect of international law, the foundation of international order, as well as respect for our resolutions, remain ignored. People in Gaza are left without homes, hospitals, schools, and other critical infrastructure. They face repeated evacuation orders without possibility to find safe shelters. They are denied access to life-saving humanitarian aid. Challenges related to the humanitarian space in Gaza are so complex that even after 1 year of the war, we cannot comprehensively summarize them. We hear calls from humanitarian workers for more decisive action of the Council. They say that only a ceasefire will enable humanitarian organizations to adequately address the tragedy in Gaza. And we agree. I think the Council agreed. We should continue to call and take action for compliance with our demand for a ceasefire. However, while demanding compliance with our resolutions, we continue to bear responsibility to easing the pain of civilians in Gaza. Colleagues, we know the tragic humanitarian situation of Palestinians will not magically disappear even once we achieve a ceasefire. A ceasefire will not automatically remove obstacles to humanitarian access. Gaza will not be safe until public order is restored. The territory of Gaza is littered with unexploded bombs that put civilians at risk, in particular children. Reconstruction will last for decades. Lack of opportunity for social and economic recovery is an excellent breeding ground for hatred, division, and extremism. We have seen that in multiple situations in the past. We should move forward in our reflections what needs to change in order for peoples of this region to live in peace and security for a change. Colleagues, attacks on the United Nations are unacceptable. It is member states who have created the United Nations. And it is precisely the United Nations which have protected what was left of humanity in Gaza. They do the work on our behalf, and they carry burden of our failures. Attacks on United Nations are unprecedented. People, assets, and premises clearly marked as UN hit on the ground. Equally alarming are attempts to dismantle UNRWA, the agency that provides essential support to Palestinian refugees. We stand by the shared commitments to UNRWA, supported by 123 member states of the UN, including all Council members. It is clear the role and mandate of UNRWA must be protected. UNRWA is a lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza. Or in words of Commissioner, entire humanitarian response in Gaza may collapse. Attacks on Secretary General are unacceptable. As a member state of this organization and in line with the Charter, we stand by the work under the leadership by the Secretary General. And finally, situation in Gaza has evolved into a threat to international peace and security. This is not anymore an assumption or a danger. It is here, it is a fact. Conflicts are spreading like an inferno across the region of the Middle East, an inferno that we must stop. More wars will not bring peace and security. More wars will not bring Israeli hostages home to their families. It is time to stop the wars, to bring hostages home, and to end suffering of the civilians in the Middle East. We call for an immediate, all-out regional ceasefire and for all parties to return to the path of diplomacy. Colleagues, the world cannot forget Gaza. This Council cannot forget Gaza. And first and foremost, we cannot forget we have the primary responsibility for international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I invite the representative of the United States.
Madam President, and thank you, Commissioner General Lazzarini and Director Dalton, for your briefings. I also want to take a moment to welcome the appointment of Tom Flesher as the new Emergency Relief Coordinator and note how important it is for all of us to work very closely with him. Colleagues, this Monday marked 1 year since Hamas's horrific terror attack in Israel, murdering 1,200 innocent people, taking 200 individuals hostage, leaving their families clinging to hope, and setting into motion this horrific situation. 1 year since Hamas unleashed a conflict that, despite our extensive diplomatic efforts, continues to inflict tremendous suffering and pain on the Palestinian civilians in Gaza and destabilizing the region. Tens of thousands have been killed in a conflict they did not start and cannot stop. Civilians have been displaced over and over again by the fighting. Parents don't know where they'll get their next meal or if they'll find a safe place for their babies to sleep. There are children whose earliest memories, whose only memories, are the sights and sounds of war, who are often injured, traumatized. And there are hostages who continue to struggle to stay alive in the squalor and darkness of Hamas's tunnels. It is far past time for a hostage and ceasefire deal consistent with Resolution 2735 to bring the hostages home, allow for a surge in humanitarian aid, assure Israel's security in this war, and move toward a two-state solution. But as we push for this deal, we must also continue to work to alleviate the humanitarian crisis unfolding before our eyes. Because let's be clear, conditions are catastrophic and will further deteriorate if additional steps are not taken. Indeed, all parties must meet their responsibilities under Resolution 2720. The flow of humanitarian aid through multiple border crossings to Palestinian civilians is desperately needed and must be allowed. To that end, we welcome the Council's extension of Senior Coordinator Cogg's reporting mandate. This will help ensure we have accurate, unfiltered information, including information about obstacles to aid deliveries. As Senior Coordinator Cogg spoke to just the other week, UN and humanitarian personnel are pursuing life-saving work. Through their efforts, we have seen some progress, most notably with the polio vaccination campaign carried out with the help of the WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA. This was a textbook example of what the UN can accomplish when it has willing partners on the ground. We need and expect the same level of coordination to extend to other urgent humanitarian efforts, including efforts to provide displaced Palestinian civilians with food, water, and resources they need to cope with the coming winter. And so the United States is concerned by the situation in northern Gaza, including the announcement by Israel of a new evacuation order for several communities. We're particularly concerned that Palestinian civilians have nowhere safe to go. Already there are devastating reports of the squalid conditions in the humanitarian zone in southern and central Gaza, where more than 1.5 million displaced civilians have fled. These catastrophic conditions were predicted months ago, and yet have still not been. That must change, and now. We call on Israel to take urgent steps to do so, and I reiterate the United States' expectation that Palestinian civilians, including those evacuated from the north, be permitted to return to their communities and rebuild. Consistent with Resolution 2735, there must be no demographic or territorial change in the Gaza Strip, including any actions that reduce the territory of Gaza. Colleagues, we are also concerned by recent action by the Israeli government to limit the delivery of goods into Gaza. When combined with new bureaucratic limits placed on humanitarian goods arriving from Jordan and the closure of most border crossings in recent weeks, these restrictions would only have the effect of intensifying suffering in Gaza. We need to see fewer barriers to the delivery of aid, not more of them. In that same spirit, we're following with deep concern the Israeli legislative proposal that could alter UNRWA's legal status, hindering its ability to communicate with Israeli officials and removing privileges and immunities afforded to UN organizations and personnel around the globe. This legislative proposal reflects the significant distrust between Israel and UNRWA. Israel has alleged, and the UN in some cases has confirmed, that a small percentage of UNRWA employees have ties to Hamas and other terrorist groups. Israel has also conveyed concerns about Hamas misusing UNRWA facilities, and the United States shares these concerns. At the same time, we know that UN personnel, including from UNRWA, are vital to the humanitarian response in Gaza and face tremendous danger while performing their work. And so Israel needs to provide UNRWA additional information regarding these allegations, and UNRWA needs to have a process to address these concerns seriously and urgently and make faster progress on the much-needed reforms outlined in the Kelowna report. Simply put, it is in no one's interest for the neutrality of UNRWA personnel to remain in doubt. Colleague, the challenges we've faced implementing Resolution 2720 and other related humanitarian resolutions reflect a simple reality. Security Council meetings and resolutions alone will not end the suffering, but the Council can and must continue to support efforts on the ground by UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations, and we can and must continue to pressure Hamas to accept the deal on the table. This must be our charge. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I shall now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. My thanks also to Commissioner General Lazzarini and Director Dalton for the information provided. Madam President, 1 year into Israel's war on Gaza, the humanitarian situation has reached the depths of illegality, immorality, and indecency. Amidst a mountain of rubble, 2 million people are battling to survive. Gaza is both the most dangerous place for aid workers and the most dangerous place to be a child. The enclave now teems with the wounded, the diseased, and the starved, as well as the displaced. If ever there was a crisis that the Council needed to address with urgency, it is the war in Gaza. Madam President, when the world learned of the brutal Hamas attack on Israel on 7th October, Condemnations were swift, and rightly so. Guyana maintains that there is no justification for the horrors that the people of Israel were forced to endure on that day, and we reiterate our strong condemnation of the 7th October attack on Israel. We condemn the infiltration of Israel's sovereign territory, the killing and injuring of innocent civilians, and the taking of hostages. Guyana further reiterates its call for the release of all hostages and for accountability for all the crimes perpetrated on October 7th. As Israel's response to the 7th October attack unfolded, the world was stunned by the brutality of the response and by the complete disregard for every tenet of international law, including international humanitarian law. The response continues to be characterized by the bombing of hospitals, schools, shelters, homes, and other civilian infrastructure. It is characterized by incessant evacuation orders to civilians while bombing them as they move, bombing them while they are in shelters, and bombing them even if they choose not to move. Humanitarian workers and United Nations personnel operate at great personal risk since they do not have the life-saving cover of functioning deconfliction and coordination mechanisms. Guyana reiterates its condemnation of the illegalities that continue to be perpetrated in Palestine. We condemn the ongoing violations of international law, the United Nations Charter, the resolutions of the Security Council, and the orders of the International Court of Justice. We call on Israel and all other parties in the war to abide by the rule of law and to prioritize the protection of civilians. Madam President, as we contemplate the long-term prospects for the people of Gaza on account of this war, there are some extremely troubling realities that we must confront. For example, the war will set children and young people's education back by up to 5 years and has created a generation of permanently traumatized Palestinian youth. The implications of this setback for development cannot be overemphasized. Neither should we underestimate the challenges that will be encountered as a result of the trauma that this war has created. Time is not enough to speak of the Herculean task that reconstruction would involve and the intense amount of resources that would be required. Madam President, the question of justice must also concern us. In Guyana's view, justice entails both accountability and redress. To be comprehensive, justice must reach beyond October 7, 2023 to May 1948. It must address the millions of Palestinians and their generations of children who have been gradually pushed off their lands, with many born as refugees and many who also died as refugees. Justice demands that these wrongs not only be acknowledged, but fully theirs. There should be no compromises on this point. The question of the UN's legitimacy must also concern us. This war has revealed staggering levels of impunity by Israel, whose actions have cut at the very core of what the organization stands for. This Council and the General Assembly have been subjected to all sorts of vitriolic indignities over this past year, and we now watch as the Israeli Knesset prepares to brand UNRWA a terrorist organization. The backbone of the humanitarian operations in Gaza continues to operate with a sword of Damocles dangling over its head. The UN and all peace-loving and moral countries must not allow Israel to shutter UNRWA and with it life-saving support for millions of Palestinians. Let us act now to safeguard the purposes and the principles of this organization. Madam President, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has shown that seeds sown in blood cannot produce plants of peace and security. On the contrary, they produce weeds of fear, of turmoil, of chaos, of insecurity, of injustice, and a constant looking over the shoulder, unsure of when the next bullet or bomb or rocket or stone would be used to perpetuate the cycle of violence. Israel must seek the only true path to peace, dialogue towards the two-state solution. Anything less is an injustice to its own citizens who live in the shadows of war and with a very fragile sense of security. Allow me to issue 3 important calls. First, this Council must take action to turn the tide on the ground. We cannot suspend our responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and hope that others will carry it out for us. Let us be united in this effort to halt the suffering across the Middle East in a war that is consuming Palestine's children. Guyana, therefore, reiterates its demand for a ceasefire and is ready to work with the Council to ensure that the ceasefire is achieved. Second, the humanitarian situation, purely man-made, is a shock to the human conscience. Civilians in Gaza desperately need our intervention, and not just with our resolutions or press statements. They need tangible action on the ground to secure urgent relief and permanent peace. Guyana therefore calls on the Council to enact measures that would deliver peace both in the short and long term. Finally, Guyana reiterates its appeal for the prioritization of all civilian lives. This includes Palestinian civilians detained in Israeli prisons without charge, persons taken hostage from Israel on 7th October, the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced across the Gaza Strip, innocent civilians in Lebanon, and the Israeli citizens themselves. The actions of the parties to this war, including Israel, clearly demonstrate that no priority is being given to the lives of civilians. Madam President, I conclude by underscoring the need for urgent action to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and end the ongoing violence in the Middle East. Guyana is prepared to do its part to this end. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Guyana.
I thank the representative of Guyana and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini of UNRWA and Director Lisa Doughton of OCHA for their briefings. This past Monday marked the first anniversary of the brutal terrorist attack by Hamas against Israel, and we have to keep in mind that more than 100 hostages are still held by Hamas in Gaza. These heinous acts must be unequivocally condemned, and the hostages must be released immediately. However, as repeatedly pointed out, the terrorist attacks by Hamas do not provide any legitimate ground for another party's violation of any international norms, including international humanitarian law and Security Council resolutions. Civilians must be protected. Humanitarian aid must not be hindered. And the Council resolutions, including 2735, should be implemented without delay. In this regard, we are extremely worried once again by the recent enormous evacuation order by the IDF, combined with the reopening of massive military operations in northern Gaza, which used to be the most populous area in the Strip. Gaza is not a chessboard, nor are the civilians remaining there chess pieces. Madam President, when the current situation broke out 1 year ago, no one could assume that the armed conflict in Gaza would last for so long. Unfortunately, we are now witnessing the most unfavorable scenario in the Middle East. Indeed, Israel's ongoing bombardment and ground operations are aggravating the unspeakable suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, and Hamas still fires rockets. Destruction and violence are also rampaging in the West Bank, with an incessant expansion of Israeli settlements. The dangerous spillover to Lebanon has become a dire reality, threatening not only Lebanese citizens but also UNIFIL. Houthis' attacks in the Red Sea are intensifying. Iran's large-scale missile attacks against Israel and the ensuing fears over massive retaliatory attacks by Israel are dragging the entire region into total despair. But let's be clear, short-term military victory will not deliver long-term peace. Under the current conflict lies intergenerational trauma alongside long-lasting hatred and distrust. And now we are witnessing a grave situation where such resentment and hatred are deepening and sharpening across the region, and they even point to UN institutions, including the Secretary General and UNRWA. We are extremely concerned by the bills advancing in the Knesset, aiming to ban UNRWA's activities. Final approval to these bills would have a devastating impact on Palestinians, with no UNRWA, no deconfliction, no humanitarian activities, and no health or educational services. This must not happen. The Republic of Korea reiterates support for the two-state solution, which is firmly supported by the vast majority of UN member states. If there are parties who believe that the two-state solution is not a viable path, they will have to answer as to what is a better alternative to guarantee durable peace in the Middle East. If there is no alternative, no one should irreversibly destroy the basic conditions to realize this common goal for a brighter future for all. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea, and I invite the representative of the United Kingdom to have the floor.
Thank you, President. And I thank Director Dalton and Commissioner General Lazzarini for their briefings. We too wish to extend our congratulations to Tom Fletcher on his appointment as the Emergency Relief Coordinator, and again to pay tribute to Martin Griffiths for his outstanding service, and to thank Joyce Masuya for her leadership over this period of transition. Now, more than ever, we need strong voices to speak up for the humanitarian community, and we look forward to working with Tom Fletcher and his team. President, this week marked a sobering milestone. We are now 1 year on from the events of the 7th of October 2023 and Hamas's brutal terrorist attack against Israel, the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. As my Prime Minister has said, we honour those lost, and we continue in our determination to ensure the return of those still held hostage. Sadly, the anguish did not end on the 7th of October. Each and every day since then, we have seen civilians suffer on a dreadful scale. We call upon Hamas and Israel to agree a ceasefire deal which would see the release of the hostages, more aid entering Gaza, and an opportunity to begin the work of reconstruction and progress towards a Palestinian state. We also call upon Hamas to stop endangering civilians. With the conflict now having spread into Lebanon, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel, and for diplomacy to take the place of violence. President, while we continue to push for regional de-escalation, it is vital that we do not lose sight of the continuing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Almost 42,000 people have been killed, according to Palestinian health officials. The majority of critical civilian infrastructure is damaged or destroyed, and civilians live in constant fear of airstrikes. More women and children have now been killed this year in Gaza than in any other global conflict in the last 2 decades. Despite Israel's commitment to flood Gaza with aid, the number of humanitarian trucks entering Gaza last month was the lowest we have seen since the start of the year. This is unacceptable and must be addressed immediately. Restrictions imposed by Israel have also led to the significant drops in the flow of commercial goods, and these shortages are driving looting and attacks on aid convoys. Humanitarian aid is therefore not reaching those who need it most, particularly in northern Gaza, which is at risk of being completely cut off. As winter approaches, it is critical that Israel take action to avoid this. As we have repeatedly said in this Council, Israel must do much more to avoid civilian casualties and ensure the UN and its humanitarian partners can operate safely and effectively. We are concerned by any efforts to undermine the UN or UNRWA, which plays an indispensable role. The UK fully supports the Secretary-General, UNRWA, and the wider UN as they seek to secure peace through diplomacy and help the people of the Middle East. That is why my government restored funding to UNRWA to support its vital work and to implement the recommendations of the Colonna report. President, what the people of Gaza need more than anything is an immediate ceasefire. We urge Israel and Hamas to return to the table and secure a deal which would achieve this. As my Prime Minister has said, the United Kingdom will not falter in our pursuit of peace and our determination to secure a better future for the region. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
je remercie Monsieur Lazzarini et Madame Dalton
for their briefings.
Un an après le début de la guerre à Gaza,
it's been 1 year since the beginning of the war in Gaza, and the scale of the humanitarian disaster has reached unprecedented levels. 80% of civilian infrastructure has been either damaged or destroyed. All of the hospitals in Gaza have been struck, and none is fully functional. Famine has taken hold. The entire population has been displaced, sometimes several times. The last evacuation orders issued by the Israeli army affect the entire population of the north of Gaza. This is extremely worrying. France reiterates its categorical opposition to any forced displacement of the population. Deconfliction is ineffective. Delivery of humanitarian assistance is being hindered, and humanitarian workers are constantly under threat of rocket fire. More than 300 have lost their lives. We pay them tribute. The requirement to respect international humanitarian law applies to everyone, including Israel. The delivery of aid must be secure, complete, and unhindered. In this context, the delivery of aid is not possible without UNRWA. France calls for support to this office, which has played an essential role for 75 years in the occupied Palestinian territories in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. France calls upon Israel to abandon the draft bills currently under examination to close UNRWA's offices in East Jerusalem, and calls upon the Israeli authorities to respect its international obligations to UNRWA, including ceasing hindrances to the work of humanitarian staff and refusing visas. Monday marked the first anniversary of the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. France has not ceased to condemn these. The Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs went to Israel for these commemorations.
l'attachement indéfectible de la France à la sécurité d'Israël. Mais dans la bande de Gaza, un cessez-le-feu doit intervenir immédiatement, comme au Liban. Les livraisons d'armes, la prolongation de la guerre et son extension au Liban ne produiront pas la sécurité attendue par les Israéliens et par tous dans la région. Un cessez-le-feu est la seule façon de mettre un terme à la crise humanitaire, comme l'a rappelé hier le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. À Gaza, la guerre doit s'arrêter maintenant. Les otages doivent être libérés sans délai. Ce Conseil l'a exigé par sa résolution 2735. Nous devons enfin œuvrer sans plus attendre à un règlement politique et à l'établissement d'un État palestinien. La France soutient une autorité palestinienne réformée, capable d'exercer ses responsabilités sur l'ensemble des territoires palestiniens, y compris dans la bande de Gaza. Nous appelons avec force Israël a cessé ses frappes massives au Liban et le Hezbollah a cessé les tirs à Israël. Les civils, qu'ils soient libanais ou israéliens, ne doivent en aucun cas être pris pour cible. La France est mobilisée et elle organisera une conférence internationale de soutien au Liban le 24 octobre à Paris. Madame la Présidente, il faut sans attendre élaborer les solutions nécessaires à la sécurité d'Israël et de tous au Moyen-Orient. La France est déterminée à contribuer à celle-ci. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de la France et je passe la parole au représentant de la Chine.
President, I thank Algeria, Slovenia, and for requesting this meeting, and thank Commissioner General Lazzarini and Ms. Dowden for their briefings. Since October last year, the Gaza conflict and the situation in the Middle East has been at the forefront of the Council's work, yet the situation has not improved so far. Instead, it has continued to deteriorate. 2 million people in Gaza are struggling under the blockade and under fire, and 1 out of every 50 people died a violent death. The authority of international law seems to exist in name only for certain states, and the line of international humanitarian law has been repeatedly shattered. In the 21st century, the occurrence of such tragedy is unimaginable and unbelievable. Like many members, we are shocked, disappointed, and outraged. However, we do not believe that the Palestinian people are destined to suffer, nor do we believe that the Council, as a collective, has exhausted all efforts to maintain peace. We cannot accept the death. We cannot accept that death and hunger have become the new normal in Gaza. Gaza is already an inferno on earth, and humanitarian assistance gives people hope for survival. The role of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, is indispensable and irreplaceable. China firmly opposes Israeli smearing and the suppression of UNRWA, and is gravely concerned about the relevant bills in the Israeli Senate targeting the agency. We urge Israel to stop weaponizing humanitarian assistance, lift the blockade of Gaza and the restrictions on humanitarian access, and cooperate fully with the UN and other humanitarian agencies. We cannot allow the conflict to drag on and expand, nor can we sit back and watch the entire Middle East plunged into an all-out war. The harsh reality has proved that winning a war doesn't necessarily mean having peace. Military might alone cannot guarantee lasting security, and the obsession with force only creates more killings and hatred. Israel must cease all military operations in Gaza and put an end to the collective punishment of the people in Gaza. The intensified settlement activity and the reign of violence in West Bank were a de facto obliteration of the foundations of the two-state solution and must stop immediately. Lebanon must not become the next Gaza. China calls on all parties to exercise restraint and achieve a ceasefire. We urge Israel in particular to stop taking actions that would further escalate the situation. We cannot ignore the marginalization of the Council. There is broad consensus among the vast majority of Council members on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. After repeated veto of the Council's demand for an immediate ceasefire, the U.S. put forward a ceasefire initiative last May, claiming that Israel had accepted it and requesting the Council's support for an agreement through diplomatic talks. However, over the past 5 months, the so-called diplomatic efforts seem to be going in circles, and more time and patience have led to greater civilian casualties and more reckless military adventurism. It is necessary to take a deep look at the current impasse and reaffirm some self-evident principles. Security Council resolutions are binding on all states, as stipulated in the UN Charter, and there is no room for distortion or interpretation in this regard. The implementation of international humanitarian law is a non-negotiable obligation and cannot be used as a bargaining chip. The principles of international law are universally applicable to all states. Double standard and selective application would set a terrible precedent with wide-ranging negative consequences. We certainly cannot lose faith in genuine diplomacy. To that end, we strongly urge the country concerned to put saving lives first, show political will, take an impartial stand, reject political calculations, and exert all available influence on the relevant party. At the same time, we support the Council in utilizing all options in its toolbox to take further action to end the war as soon as possible and restore peace at an early date. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. Thank you. Madam President, I would like to thank OCHA and UNRWA for their briefings and reiterate the appreciation of my country for the work of the United Nations and its agencies and support for its selfless and indispensable work. President, colleagues, it's been 1 year and 2 days since the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other militant groups, where more than 1,200 people were murdered in the south of Israel. Thousands were wounded and 250 were kidnapped, of which 100 still remain in captivity. The atrocities committed on that day included sexual violence, and the fate of the hostages cannot be forgotten. It is regrettable and incomprehensible that 1 year after these acts of terror, the immediate cause for the war that laid waste to the Gaza Strip, the Security Council has not been able to clearly condemn these acts and its perpetrators. Ecuador, for its part, once again condemns these terrorist acts and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still under Hamas's control. We said this a year ago, we continue to say this. Ecuador recognizes the imminent right to legitimate self-defense of member states of the United Nations in the case of an armed attack, but we recall that this should be done according to the terms enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter. Madam President, the civilian population in Gaza has had to bear the consequences of 1 year of this war, which has led to tens of thousands of people dying and being wounded, including women and children. They are the ones that suffer the brunt of this violence. The violence must stop now. The fighting must stop. The bombing, the launching of rockets, and the acts of terrorism which continue to expose innocent civilians to loss of life and limb. It is fundamental to remember that respect for the norms of international humanitarian law is not optional for any of the parties involved in this conflict. Failure to comply brings with it serious international responsibilities which we cannot ignore. Colleagues, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, as we have heard, is disastrous. Thousands of civilians are suffering the consequences of conflict, facing shortage of food, water, medicines and essential services, such as education for children. This crisis not only requires an urgent response, but also a sustained commitment on the part of the international community to mitigate the suffering and protect fundamental human rights. The 4 resolutions adopted by this Council have not been implemented. This must be done immediately. No excuses, no delays. It is necessary to implement an agreement that will make it possible to bring about an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and the entry of humanitarian assistance in sufficient amounts and in a timely manner. The time has come for bold political decisions which prioritize the common good. The time has come to protect civilians, humanitarian workers, and to respect the institutions which assist them. Any initiatives which hinders the work of United Nations agencies that provide this humanitarian assistance is worrying and dangerous. Madam President, the final resolution to this conflict will not come through force. Almost 8 decades of unsuccessful attempts using this approach should be sufficient. I've said this very many times, I say it again on this occasion. The only way towards an outcome is a negotiated, peaceful and lasting and just solution between the parties with the existence of 2 states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and relevant resolutions. Only then will it be possible for both peoples to live in dignity and in security. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we're grateful to Algeria and Slovenia for convening this meeting to discuss the serious humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. We're grateful to the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, OCHA Director, for their objective and honest assessment of the unprecedented catastrophe occurring in the occupied Palestinian territory, OPT, where IDF has been conducting a military operation for over a year now. Russia unequivocally condemned Hamas's actions against residents and others living in border areas of Israel on the 7th of October, the killing of civilians, taking hostages, including women, the elderly and children. We're acutely disappointed by the fact that 1 year on, over 100 people remain in captivity, and that to secure their release, the necessary diplomatic efforts, as per Security Council decisions, are not being undertaken. Among those injured, there are also Russian citizens. We stand convinced that terrorist methods cannot be justified, and that violence against both Israeli and Palestinian civilians is unacceptable. Having said that, all those who are still capable of compassion are outraged by the fact that this tragedy has been used for over a year now for a ruthless and an inhumane mass collective punishment of Palestinians, who are confronting a humanitarian catastrophe that's unprecedented since the times of World War II. Almost 72,000 people have died, most of them women and children. Wounded and missing close to 100,000. 2 million IDPs. This is the result of the stubbornness of the Israeli leadership and West Jerusalem's allies, who are providing cover, the U.S. that is, who are preventing the Security Council from stopping this vicious cycle of violence. The Enclave's territory is the world's biggest open-air prison. It's been subjected to mass bombing and shelling on a daily basis. In Gaza, there's nowhere that's safe for civilians. Civilian infrastructure is being purposefully destroyed. The provision of first aid to civilians is being blocked. Before the eyes of the international community, humanitarian convoys are being shot at and shot dead. Over 300 humanitarian workers have died, including 226 UNRWA personnel. In parallel, in the West Bank, a bloody operation run by the Israeli military is continuing as well as clashes pitting settlers and residents. Just yesterday, during a security force raid on Kalandi refugee camp, a 12-year-old Palestinian boy died and at least 8 people were wounded in fact. In total, since the 7th of October, over 11,000 Palestinians have been put behind bars in Israel, and they're enduring harsh and degrading treatment. What can be deemed a relative success of the UN's humanitarian wing is the polio vaccination campaign, which covered 500,000 Palestinian children under the age of 10, even though, according to the information we're getting, UN humanitarian bodies haven't yet managed to secure from Western Jerusalem even a short humanitarian pause for the conduct of the second phase of the vaccination campaign and for the distribution of aid. Madam President, against this backdrop, what's particularly concerning and perplexing is the fact that the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset is working on 2 bills, one banning UNRWA's work on Israeli territory and the other revoking immunities and privileges for UNRWA staff. If these bills are adopted, what will be threatened is not only the ongoing work of UNRWA in Gaza and in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, but the prospects of providing assistance to Palestinian refugees in neighboring Arab states as well, Syria, in Lebanon, and Jordan, which have already seen their capacities dimmed by the catastrophic shortage of funds due to the US's decision to suspend UNRWA funding out to the month of March 2025. Israel's plans vis-à-vis UNRWA would be a violation of the UN Charter and the Convention on Privileges and Immunities of the UN, as well as relevant UNGA resolutions. They would have the most negative repercussions for the Middle East as a whole, as well as for the entire UN system. In essence, Israel is claiming that it has the right to impose arbitrary bans on the work of UN specialized agencies that are not to its liking. Colleagues, we have no right to allow this to pass. The precipitous degradation of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the ongoing dismantlement of UNRWA in the OPT requires our swift intervention. This is what the entire international community is expecting from the UN. We need to defend the agency, which has a singular capacity to provide social, educational, and medical services, which are of critical importance not only during this acute, difficult period, but also for post-conflict reconstruction in the enclave and for preventing the radicalization of Palestinian society. Let me underscore that undermining UNRWA's mandate threatens the maintenance of Palestinian refugees' status, which could thwart efforts to achieve a just solution, which is a cornerstone for the entire Middle East, a just solution of the Palestinian issue. Madam President, almost 1 year ago, the Secretary General said, and rightly so, that the events that transpired on the 7th of October did not occur in a vacuum. What prompted this strategy was the systematic ignoring of Security Council decisions, which are binding as per the UN Charter, as well as the flurry of consensus-based resolutions we've had over the last 80 years, resolutions about the establishment of an independent Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. Colleagues, in this context, I'd like to remind you that in 1949, the State of Israel joined the UN on the condition that it would uphold and implement 2 key UNGA resolutions. Number 181, which contained a plan to divide Palestine into 2 states, an Arab state and a Jewish state, and 194 on refugees, which is the very basis for UNRWA's mandate. Moreover, the ICJ's second advisory opinion, which was adopted by a UNGA resolution, there is a clear conclusion about the fact that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including Eastern Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, is unlawful. So we have a paradox on our hands. By sabotaging the implementation of the aforementioned resolutions, Israel is in fact knowingly and purposefully undermining decisions and understandings which allowed it itself, Israel, to join the UN. And yet to this day, Palestinians are being denied their full membership in the UN. And this denial is occurring with the active connivance of the aforementioned American allies of Israel, who are unilaterally casting vetoes, such as the one against the relevant draft resolution drafted by Algeria. On the whole, we regret that we're compelled to conclude that the U.S., in order to allow Israel to do as it pleases, has blocked on 5 occasions substantive Security Council decisions to help end the conflict. In June, Washington put forward Resolution 2735, which the Council did end up adopting. Well, we warned that this resolution would thwart any new initiatives aimed to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. Yet we could see from the outset that Israel's leadership was not prepared to act in accordance with the so-called Biden plan, which that resolution contained. The outcome of this American-Israeli operation is a series of assassinations in the region, which only serves to confirm that West Jerusalem is not interested in resolving this through peaceful means, instead opting for the use of force. The outcome is such that dialogue on a ceasefire in Gaza is in a deep impasse. The release of remaining hostages is not being discussed any longer in Washington nor in West Jerusalem. As for the region, it's confronting a large-scale escalation in Lebanon and facing the prospect of a direct conflict pitting Israel against Iran. And yet our U.S. colleagues on the Council continue to duck behind the aforementioned Resolution 2735 as if nothing had happened, asserting that supposedly any new steps undertaken by the SC will only hinder efforts. Today, we were told that Security Council decisions won't help the cause, but that the UN should take measures to improve the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza. I do apologize, but such assertions cannot be accepted. These assertions are borderline blasphemous. How can we criticize the UN? How can we call on the UN to discharge its humanitarian mission when there are ongoing bombings which are hindering the delivery of humanitarian assistance, when UN and other humanitarian workers are being assassinated, and when UNRWA is being threatened with closure? How can we demand the UN to discharge its mandate? We can do that on the condition that there is a ceasefire. This is something we've been talking about since day one, and other Council members are also discussing this, except one member, and that Council put forward a Resolution 2735, which was destined to be a failure. And this is something the Secretary General has stated clearly, and other UN representatives. But it's all in vain. West Jerusalem has not heard these calls, and those providing cover for West Jerusalem, as we said before, they're ducking behind this disingenuous Resolution 2735. Madam President, we all understand that the current catastrophic situation can and should be settled solely through political and diplomatic means, with the active involvement of all Middle Eastern countries and powers from beyond the region. Our common objective is to ensure the implementation of Security Council and GA resolutions, to put an end to the bloodshed, which risks spilling over to the rest of the Middle East, and what's most important, to guarantee that Palestinians can exercise their lawful right to self-determination, allowing them to establish, not in word, but in deed on the ground, to establish a territorially contiguous and viable state within 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Security Council can and should act to fulfill its mandate, the mandate of maintaining international peace and security. Only our collective decisiveness and principled stance will allow us to force the US and Israel to respect international law and to comply with Security Council and UNGA decisions. We're counting on the solidarity and the active position of all our Council colleagues. All our Council colleagues. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant de la Russie.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Commissioner General Lazzarini of UNRWA and Director Dalton of OCHA for their briefings. 1 year into this conflict, it's still a sad reality that the bloodshed continues in the Gaza Strip since the unjustifiable and horrific attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians which resulted in over 1,200 deaths, as well as injuries, displacements, sexual violations, and hundreds of men, women, and children taken as hostages. We repeat our condemnation of these heinous acts and call for the release of the remaining 101 hostages still held in Gaza without any indication of their health conditions or access by the RCRC as required by international humanitarian law. 1 year on from the response by Israel, the Gaza Strip has witnessed a period of repeated violence and intensified hostilities that has claimed over 42,000 lives, injured tens of thousands more, destroyed almost all infrastructure, shattered families, and destabilized the entire community. The Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, in this paper, The Human Toll, Indirect Deaths from War in Gaza and the West Bank, October 7, 2023, forward, states that the additional indirect deaths in Gaza and the West Bank stand at more than 67,000. Undoubtedly, civilians remain central in all of this, as they have been stripped of all the protection accorded them under international law with seeming impunity. For the past months, reports from the United Nations and other humanitarian experts have painted a dire and devastating picture of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, by often referring to it as a humanitarian disaster and massive human rights crisis. It has been reported that over 1.5 million civilians did not receive their food rations in September, even though over 100,000 metric tons of food supplies were stocked outside the Gaza Strip, owing to various factors of access restriction, damaged roads, and heightened insecurity. This food shortage in the Gaza Strip is worrying for a population that has been forced by prevailing circumstances to rely exclusively on humanitarian aid. On this note, we recognize the efforts of UNRWA and other humanitarian personnel who, despite the challenges, continue to do their utmost in delivering aid and providing assistance to civilians in need. Evacuation orders are significantly impacting humanitarian operations, particularly between southern and northern Gaza. Schools and hospitals can no longer be utilized for their intended purpose, as they have been either destroyed, lack the basic facilities, or used as shelters for a displaced population. The mandate of UNRWA, a United Nations agency and the backbone of human operations in the Gaza Strip, is at risk if the proposed legislation in the Israeli Knesset is approved. It will weaken its influence in the region and curtail its operations. Since the start of the conflict, we have seen repeated attacks on its personnel, premises, and mandates. Such actions will only compound the crisis for the 1.9 million internally displaced people relying mainly on the services of UNRWA to survive and thrive. As several challenges continue to stretch humanitarian personnel beyond their abilities and expose an entire population to malnutrition, disease, starvation, and death, Sierra Leone would like to emphasize the following 3 points. First, we reiterate the call of the Security Council in the resolutions 2712 and 2720 that demanded consistent international law, continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services important to the well-being of civilians throughout the Gaza Strip. By this, we request that all access restrictions into the Gaza Strip be lifted. Second, Sierra Leone reaffirms its support for UNRWA and other humanitarian partners operating in the region, considering the particular operational, political, and security context in which they work. We will continue to implore UNRWA to commit to implementing the recommendations outlined in the Independent Review Group report titled Independent Review of Mechanism and Procedures to ensure its adherence to humanitarian principles of neutrality. Third, we emphasize that all civilians must be protected at all times in conformity with international law, including international humanitarian law, which requires a distinction between military targets and civilians. In conclusion, we urgently call for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and the region. Experts have advised that the prevailing conditions will be more catastrophic as winter approaches. Therefore, an immediate halt in the fighting is essential to save this generation from the scourge of war. We call on parties to the conflict to exercise their political will and engage constructively to achieve a tangible outcome. Sierra Leone remains committed to find a lasting peace to this conflict, with the two-state solution being the ultimate end. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Sierra Leone et je passe la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Ms. Lisa Doughton from OSHA and UNRWA's Commissioner General Lazzarini for their briefings. Today's meeting marks a grim milestone for this Council. 1 year has passed since the terrible 7th October attacks by Hamas in Israel, in which over 1,200 people were killed. 1 year since Israel launched a devastating military campaign in Gaza, which has killed at least 41,600 people, injuring countless more, and decimated the Gaza Strip. 1 year of captivity, uncertainty, and fear for the hostages who are still held by Hamas. Unending suffering for the thousands held in Israeli administrative detention sites. Over this past year, this Council has held countless meetings and has adopted 4 resolutions. These remain woefully unimplemented, and the situation continues to deteriorate. This is personified by the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Civilians are subject to unimaginable hardships and repeated displacements, deprived of essential access to healthcare, shelter, food, electricity, and the lifeline of humanitarian aid. Tragically, children have suffered the most. Subject to unspeakable violence, which will have a marked effect on their psychological well-being. Deprived of adequate food, affecting their physical development. Denied the right to education, losing an entire year of schooling. Schools, once a safe haven, still suffer continuous have also become targets of systematic attacks. These actions represent a grave assault on the principles we stand for. Malta once more stresses that international humanitarian law must be adhered to. Military force must not be used to target civilians and civilian infrastructure. The full and immediate implementation of the ICJ's orders on provisional measures is essential. We underline that all member states are bound by international law, as reflected in the recent advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Malta condemns the fact that humanitarian efforts, vital to survival, face repeated obstructions and attacks. As we have heard from Commissioner General Lazzarini, more than 220 UNRWA personnel have been killed in the past year, making it the highest death toll for the UN in its history. We are extremely concerned with the latest news regarding the Knesset legislation being adopted against UNRWA. The agency operates out of a decades-old General Assembly mandate and is an irreplaceable actor for humanitarian efforts in the occupied Palestinian territory. This legislation risks compromising the ability to provide life-saving assistance. Its inability to work in the region, including in the West Bank, will have devastating consequences. We call on these actions to be reversed, so that Palestinians may continue receiving the support they so desperately need. More broadly, attacks against the United Nations, including measures directly targeting the Secretary General, do not contribute to an improvement of the current desperate situation. President, the untenable and immoral nature of this situation is painfully clear. However, the path out of this catastrophe and towards peace is also clear. An immediate and permanent ceasefire, in line with Council Resolution 2735, must be agreed. The hostages must be released, and Israel must allow humanitarian aid to flow unhindered into Gaza through all possible crossings. The fighting must stop. States with influence over all sides of this conflict must exert it in the direction of peace. Gaza is in the eye of the storm of conflicts raging across the Middle East. Elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory, the situation in the West Bank remains of grave concern. The worsening situation, including settler violence and increase in settlement building, undermines the achievement of the two-state solution. We need to ensure that de-escalatory efforts and diplomacy are prioritized to ensure ceasefires in both Gaza and Lebanon. This Council has the responsibility to decisively act towards this end. This approach will allow us to work for a credible political horizon and the irreversible realization of the two-state solution in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. It is only this path which will guarantee peace for Israelis, for Palestinians, and for the wider region. 1 year of war is a year too many. We cannot afford to delay peace any longer. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte et je passe la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Madam President, I thank Switzerland Presidency for convening this briefing and to Algeria and Slovenia for requesting it. We also thank Ms. Lisa Doughton, OSHA Director, and UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Filippo Lazzarini, for the updated information on the current humanitarian situation in Gaza. The briefings we have heard today paint a stark picture of the crisis, one that demands our immediate and concerted attention. Madam President, 2 days ago marked 1 year since Hamas militants attacked civilian targets in Israel, an act that we condemn and deplore. Concurrently, October 7th also marked a year of Israel's response, a disproportionate military attack on the Gaza Strip that resulted in unprecedented casualties, displacement, and destruction of civilian infrastructure. Last December, the appalling human suffering, physical destruction, and collective trauma led the UN Secretary General to invoke Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations, an exceptional measure. 10 months later, the conflict persists unabated. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is deeply concerning. The ongoing conflict has a full-blown humanitarian crisis, underscoring the urgent need for sustained humanitarian assistance and protection for both civilians and aid workers. We must emphasize that denying humanitarian access to innocent civilians is both morally and legally unacceptable. The collective punishment of civilians and the targeting of infrastructure critical for their survival are clear violations of international humanitarian law. All parties must prioritize the protection and allow unimpeded humanitarian aid to flow freely. This appeal remains valid as long as the situation persists. Madam President, this Council has adopted measures to address the crisis in Gaza, including resolutions 2720 and 2735, proposing a comprehensive three-phase ceasefire deal to end the conflict in Gaza. This includes an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, the exchange of prisoners, and the withdrawal of Israel forces from populated areas in Gaza. Regrettably, the implementation of these resolutions continue to face significant challenges, including lack of political will, security guarantees, and effective delivery of humanitarian aid. Given the worsening situation and its potential regional implication, it is imperative that we explore viable alternatives to address this crisis in Gaza. To this end, we propose the following key recommendations. First, intensify diplomatic efforts to bring all parties to the negotiated table, engaging influential nations, including members of this Council, to leverage their influence to de-escalate the conflict and reach to a sustainable ceasefire. Second, ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid by enforcing international laws that prevent the obstruction of aid to reach those in need. Third, work towards a constructive and sustainable political solution that addresses the underlying causes of the conflict, including issues of self-determination and human rights for the Palestinian people. Fourth, strengthen existing resolution by adopting more robust and enforceable measures that mandate immediate and hinder the humanitarian access to Gaza. Fifth, invest in Gaza's economic development and infrastructure to help alleviate some of the underlying issues, including improving access to clean water, electricity, delivery of food, medical supplies, and creating job opportunities. And lastly, mobilize international support for the reconstruction of Gaza, including rebuilding infrastructure, schools, and hospitals to improve living conditions and foster long-term stability. Madam President, while challenging, combining immediate humanitarian relief with long-term political solutions offers a pathway towards a more stable and peaceful future for Gaza and the broader region. In conclusion, we reiterate our unwavering support and solidarity with the Secretary General, reaffirming our fullest confidence in his vital work aimed at promoting lasting peace, justice, and stability in the Middle East and beyond. I thank you.
Du Mozambique,
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini and OCHA Director Dodon for their variable and sobering briefings. We express our deepest condolences to the families of the aid workers who have lost their lives performing their duties, including 226 UNRWA staff members. We also pay tribute to those who are bravely working on the ground despite the unimaginable conditions. An entire year has passed since the current conflict in Gaza began. Japan once again firmly condemns the acts of terror and the taking of hostages by Hamas and others on October 7th last year and onward. Since then, Gaza has been reduced to ruins and casualties continue to mount. The relentless hostilities have created nothing short of a humanitarian catastrophe. About 90% of the population are internally displaced, and much-needed humanitarian assistance is not getting into the hands of the desperate people. Amidst this calamity, the role of UNRWA has been indispensable. UNRWA has provided food, medicines, and other basic human necessities to vulnerable Palestinian refugees. Without UNRWA, their lives would be in jeopardy. UNRWA has also provided critical child care services, such as recent polio vaccine campaigns. Therefore, UNRWA has been and will be vitally important for both the present and future generations of the Palestinian refugees. Japan is deeply concerned about the bills recently approved by the Foreign Affairs and the Defense Committee of the Israeli Knesset, which would severely restrict the activities of UNRWA. We have listened carefully to Mr. Lazarini's sobering remarks that these bills would have a devastating impact on UNRWA and those who depend on the agency. Japan has been a partner of UNRWA since 1953, even before we joined the United Nations. we will continue to support the work of UNRWA as we have done for 7 decades. Our message is clear. The agency must be protected and guaranteed a safe and unhindered operating space. We also would like to recall the important role of the United Nations in resolving the armed conflict and mitigating the humanitarian impact in the Middle East. Madam President, as everybody knows, an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale are crucial to end the ongoing nightmare. The deal outlined in Resolution 2735 has been on the table for months, and we strongly call on the parties to accept it without any further delay. Japan remains hopeful that the tireless and commendable mediation efforts by the US, Egypt, and Qatar will achieve a breakthrough soon. In the meantime, we will continue to engage in diplomatic efforts. Earlier today, our new foreign minister had a talk with the Israeli foreign minister and called for Israel's maximum cooperation to strengthen humanitarian assistance activities. Moreover, we have already contributed $128 million since last October to Palestinians in dire need, and we will continue to provide emergency humanitarian assistance. Madam President, beyond Gaza, the humanitarian situation in Lebanon is especially worrying, where reportedly thousands of civilians have been killed or wounded, and about 1 million people are displaced. Japan strongly urges all parties to take all measures to prevent civilian casualties. We stand ready to provide necessary humanitarian assistance to the people in need. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon et je me permets à présent de faire une déclaration à titre national. Je remercie, comme mes collègues, le commissaire général de l'UNRWA, M. Philippe Lazzarini, et la directrice de la division financement et partenariat d'OCHA, Mme Lisa Dalton, non seulement de leur présentation, mais surtout aussi de leur grand engagement dans les circonstances les plus difficiles. Un an après le 7 octobre 2023, la Suisse reste profondément choquée par les actes de terreur et la prise d'otages perpétrés par le Hamas en Israël. Mon pays réitère sa ferme condamnation de ces actes et exprime toute sa sympathie envers les victimes et leurs proches. Nos pensées vont aussi aux familles des otages encore détenus à Gaza, dont j'ai eu l'honneur de recevoir plusieurs, et nous partageons leur peine et admirons leur courage. Et nous le répétons, la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des otages est exigée par toutes les résolutions adoptées par ce Conseil depuis le 7 octobre. Nous condamnons par ailleurs les tirs de roquettes par le Hamas contre Israël, comme celle d'avant-hier. Depuis le 7 octobre, pourtant, et nous l'avons entendu de tous les collègues ici, sans exception, l'escalade massive de la violence, notamment à travers les opérations militaires israéliennes, a exacerbé la souffrance de la population civile à Gaza de façon incommensurable. Nous connaissons les chiffres. Plus de 41 000 personnes sont mortes. 2,2 millions de personnes, soit l'ensemble de la population, vivent dans des conditions catastrophiques, sans aucune protection, en proie aux hostilités incessantes, à la famine et aux épidémies. Le bilan humain du conflit est dévastateur, aussi en Cisjordanie. La Suisse condamne le fait que les hostilités et autres actes de violence fassent de nombreux civils en territoire palestinien occupé, dont beaucoup d'enfants. Plusieurs millions de civils ont été déplacés de force en raison des hostilités, y compris à la suite d'ordres répétés d'évacuation. La Suisse appelle encore une fois la mise en œuvre immédiate des 4 résolutions adoptées par ce Conseil depuis le 7 octobre. Elles sont contraignantes et cela comprend un cessez-le-feu immédiat à Gaza. L'aide humanitaire arrivant à Gaza reste largement insuffisante, nous l'avons entendu. Toutes les parties ont l'obligation d'autoriser et de faciliter l'accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave, conformément au droit international humanitaire. La faim s'étend à Gaza. L'usage de la famine comme méthode de guerre est un crime de guerre en vertu du statut de Rome de la Cour pénale internationale.
under the
selon
Rome
les
Statute of
ordonnances
the
de la Cour
ICJ.
internationale de justice
According to the
contraignantes
orders
pour
of
les
the
parties en
ICJ,
question,
which are binding on
Israël
parties in
doit
question,
prendre sans
Israel
délai toutes les
must,
mesures nécessaires et
without
effectives
delay, take
en
all of
étroite
the necessary and
coopération avec
effective
l'ONU
measures working
pour
in close
assurer
cooperation
sans
with the UN
restriction et
to
à grande
ensure
échelle la fourniture des
that
services de base
basic
et de l'aide
services and
humanitaire
humanitarian
requise de
aid
toute
is
urgence
delivered
à la
without delay
population
and at
par
scale
tous les points de
to the
passage et dans
population
toute
through
la
all
bande de
checkpoints
Gaza.
and this throughout the Gaza
Ceci
Strip.
est aussi crucial à la veille de la deuxième
This
phase
is
de la
particularly
campagne de
important on the
vaccination
eve
contre
of
la
the second
poliomyélite.
phase of the
La
polio
première phase a
vaccination
montré
campaign.
que les
The
Nations Unies
first
et ses
phase
agences
showed that the UN
spécialisées,
and its specialized
notamment
agencies,
l'OMS, l'UNICEF
specifically
et
the
l'UNRWA,
WHO, UNICEF, and
peuvent remplir
UNRWA,
la mission d'aide
can fulfill
humanitaire
their
qui
humanitarian
leur était
aid
garantie
mission,
par le droit international
which they are
humanitaire s'il
guaranteed
existe une
under
volonté
international
politique à cet
humanitarian
effet.
law, on the proviso that
Comme le
there's
rappelle la
political will to
résolution
do so.
2730, le
In keeping
personnel
with the
humanitaire
resolution
est notamment
2730,
protégé par le
humanitarian
droit
personnel
international humanitaire
is
et les
specifically
attaques ne
protected
doivent pas
by
être
international
dirigées contre
humanitarian
eux.
law, and attacks should
Or,
not
depuis le 7
target such
octobre,
workers.
plus de
And yet, since
300
October 7th,
travailleurs
over
humanitaires ont
300
été tués
humanitarian
dans
workers
ce
have been
conflit.
killed in this
La
conflict.
Suisse a condamné les
Switzerland
attaques et la
condemned the
violence
attacks
perpétrées
and the
contre le personnel
violence
de l'ONU,
waged
y
against
compris par
UN
des colons
personnel,
israéliens contre le
including
bureau
by
de
Israeli
l'UNRWA à
settlers
Jérusalem-Est cette année.
who attacked
L'UNRWA,
UNRWA
dont
offices
le
in East
mandat est
Jerusalem this year.
conféré par
UNRWA
l'Assemblée générale
was conferred
depuis
its mandate by
1949,
the
est
General
le plus
Assembly
grand
starting in
acteur humanitaire
1949.
dans le
It is the
territoire
biggest
palestinien
humanitarian
occupé
actor
et
in
joue
the
un rôle
OPT.
crucial
It plays
pour
a
empêcher une
crucial role
déstabilisation encore plus
with a view
grande
to
de la
preventing
région.
an even greater
En
destabilization
Cisjordanie,
in the
à
region.
l'ombre de
In
l'escalade
the West
régionale,
Bank, in the
la
shadow of
violence
the regional
s'intensifie.
escalation,
Les moyens
violence is
militaires
intensifying.
utilisés en témoignent.
The
Jamais
military
autant
means
d'attaques
being used
aériennes n'ont
attest
eu
to
lieu
this.
depuis la
Not
seconde
since the second
y
intifada
compris en
have
fin de
there
semaine
been so
dernière
many
à Tulkarem,
aerial attacks,
causant des victimes civiles.
including last week
Dans le
in
cadre
Tulkarem,
d'opérations des forces de
resulting in
sécurité
civilian
israéliennes,
casualties
l'usage de la force
deaths.
doit notamment répondre aux critères
Within
de
the framework
proportionnalité
of
et
Israeli
respecter les droits de tout
Defense Forces and
individu à
Security
la
Forces
vie et à la
operations,
sécurité de
the use
sa
of force
personne.
must meet the
À
criteria of
l'heure où la
proportionality and
région
respect
tout
the rights
entière
of all
sombre
individuals
de
to
plus
life
en
and
plus dans la
security of the
violence,
person.
nous
At a
appelons
time when
les
the
États
entire
membres à
region is
réaffirmer leur
increasingly
soutien
engulfed in
à
violence, we call
l'engagement
on
des
all member
Nations
states to
Unies en
reiterate their
vertu de la
support
Charte.
to the UN's
La
commitment
Suisse
in
réitère aussi
accordance
son plein
with the
soutien au
Charter.
travail du secrétaire
Switzerland reiterates
général
its full
et de
support to the
ses hauts
work of the
représentants
SG
et
and
condamne les récents
SRSGs.
propos à
We
leurs
condemn
égard.
statements that were
À
recently
travers son
made
action
about them.
humanitaire à Gaza, mais aussi
Through its
ses bons
humanitarian
offices
activities in
et ses
Gaza,
opérations de maintien de
also
la paix
its
dans la
good
région,
offices and its peacekeeping
notamment au
operations
Liban,
in the region,
l'ONU
specifically
reste
in Lebanon,
cruciale
the
pour
UN
remédier à
remains of
l'escalade
paramount
régionale
importance so as to
qui menace
remedy
la paix et la
the regional
sécurité
escalation
internationale.
which threatens
Nous
international
appelons
peace
toutes
and
les parties au
security. We
conflit
call
à
on all parties
respecter
to
le
the
droit
conflict to
international
uphold
humanitaire
international
en tout
humanitarian
temps
law
et en
at
toutes
all times
circonstances.
and under
En
all
outre,
circumstances.
nous rappelons que
Furthermore,
tous les
we
États
recall that
ont
all
aussi
states
l'obligation de
are
faire
duty-bound
respecter ce
to
droit.
ensure
Nous appelons donc
this
tous les États à
law
user
is
de leur
upheld. We
influence
call
à
on
cet
all
effet.
states to wield their influence
La
to
Suisse
this end.
condamne toutes les
Switzerland
violations du droit
condemns all
international
violations of
humanitaire
international
par toutes les
humanitarian
parties
law
au
by all
conflit.
parties to the
Cette
conflict.
année marque le
This year marks the
75e
75th
anniversaire
anniversary of the
de
adoption
l'adoption
of the
des
Geneva
conventions de Genève
Conventions
de
of
1949.
1949.
Ces conventions
These
représentent,
conventions
de par leur
represent,
universalité,
through their
un véritable
universality,
succès du
the
multilatéralisme.
resounding success of
Or,
multilateralism.
les innombrables
And yet,
souffrances humaines dans
countless
la
human
région
suffering in the
sont les
region
sombres
are a
rappels que ces
dark
conventions,
reminder
ainsi
that
que
these
l'ensemble des
conventions,
règles
as
du
well
droit
as
international
all of the
humanitaire,
rules
sont
which
aujourd'hui
make up
bafouées.
international humanitarian law,
La violation
are
de
being
ces règles
flouted
constitue une
today.
menace pour la paix
The
et la
violation of
sécurité
such rules is
internationale
a
dont
threat
nous,
to international
membres du
peace and
Conseil de
security, which
sécurité,
we,
sommes
Security
les
Council
garants.
members, are
Nous
the
devons unir
guarantors
nos
of.
forces afin
We must
de
pool
faire
our
du
efforts
respect
so
du
as
droit
to
international
ensure that
humanitaire une priorité politique. Le respect du droit international est la boussole pour le règlement des différends, pour prévenir une escalade régionale encore plus grave et limiter les souffrances. Le respect de la Charte, du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme doit être la ligne de conduite incontournable pour toutes les parties au conflit. Enfin, nous rappelons qu'il est urgent de retrouver un horizon politique conforme aux résolutions de l'ONU. La solution à deux États démocratiques, Israël et Palestine, dont Gaza fait partie intégrante, vivant côte à côte en paix à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues, est l'unique issue possible. À cet égard, je vous remercie. Je reprends mes fonctions de président du Conseil et je donne maintenant la parole à l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine.
Madam President, allow me, allow me at the outset to thank Slovenia and Algeria for requesting this meeting, and also to thank the briefers, Mr. Lazzarini and Ms. Dunton, for their words, but more importantly, for the actions undertaken by their agencies, notably UNRWA, in impossible circumstances to try and preserve whatever is left of life and dignity for over 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Humanitarians are operating at the peril of their lives, and they are among the primary targets of Israeli attacks as an integral part of its attempts to deny any protection to the Palestinian civilian population. Mr. President, it is clear, Madam President, it is clear beyond any doubt at this stage that Israel has made the decision to launch an all-out war against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, destroying part of that population to get rid of all remaining parts. It also considers that anyone helping sustain life in Gaza is an enemy and a target as well. That is why it is killing at a scale never seen in recent years. Doctors, medical workers, humanitarian workers, members of rescue teams, UN staff, and journalists. This is evident in Israelis' ongoing massacres in the north of Gaza. They are accompanied with evacuation orders to the hospitals, the 3 hospitals that they were mentioned in this chamber in the area. Hospitals like homes and shelters are bombed and besieged and attacked. The threat of the destruction of the population as a whole serves at forcibly displacing it, not for its safety, but to seize control of that territory and to force it into submission. The unprecedented attacks against the UN and its Secretary General, as well as the attacks against UNRWA, the physical attacks against its staff through killing, maiming, detaining, and torturing them, the attacks against its headquarters, the bombings of UNRWA schools, shelters, offices, and storehouses and distribution centers, and now the threat of legislation to prevent UNRWA from operating at all in the occupied Palestinian territory have to be understood in that context. And in this connection, we totally support UNRWA and what Lazzarini said, and to take it very seriously. And UNRWA is a very indispensable organization that should be protected by all means. It is the greatest success story in the history of the United Nations. If the aim, of course, of the Israeli aim, is to make Gaza unlivable, then it must attack the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, UNRWA. The real target from the attacks on the UN in general and UNRWA in particular are the Palestine refugees. The agency serves and the entire Palestinian civilian population in Gaza who became dependent on UNRWA's support for survival during this genocide. Israel, the occupying power, has the obligation to protect that population and provide for it. Not only is it failing to do so, not only is it attacking the population instead of protecting it, it is also attacking those who are responding to the needs of this population, given Israel's failure to uphold its own obligations in this regard. It is not listening to any one of you. You keep repeating yourself. We had dozens of meetings. I heard the word must maybe 100 times in this session. Must to have ceasefire, must to have a humanitarian assistance, must to do all the things, a long list, and one country is not listening to you. And you are refusing collectively to use the tools available to you to implement its resolutions. The last one, 2735, starts with a ceasefire. You repeat that and you ask for it and you say we must have a ceasefire, and one is not listening, ignoring you. At times in the past used to lecture you that why are you wasting your time in this discussion? You should be paying attention to another country. Now they change the style. You talk, they play with their cell phones, and they're ignoring you. And you keep repeating the same thing. You don't have teeth. You are not using the tools that are available to you in order to make them to listen to you. You're not using that. You keep repeating the same thing. And I wonder if the people watching us, especially in Palestine and in the Middle East, they heard this record so many times before. Who is stopping you from imposing and forcing your resolution to be implemented, to have a ceasefire? There's one standing in your way. And you are refusing to use the tools. You keep calling for, appealing for, must do this, must do that, and the one is not listening. And I think Einstein, if I'm not mistaken, said that you keep repeating the same thing, expecting different results when you fail. It's an exercise in futility. And you are a perfect example of that saying of that brilliant man, Einstein. Israel is breaching international law by occupying this land, by annexing it, by failing to protect the occupied people, by attacking the people under its occupation, and by preventing those who wish to protect them from doing so. It is a multi-layered breach of the most fundamental rules of international law, from the Charter to the Geneva Conventions, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the Rome Statutes, with the aim of annihilating the Palestinian people. That's the objective. Israel has killed and maimed the Palestinian civilian population and those who could protect them or heal their injuries. And we sent you, a few days ago, a long letter, 7 pages, giving you all the details of our story during the course of last year. So I did not need to repeat to you all of the details. Some of you referred to the details. It forcibly displaced the population and bombed the shelters and those who were trying to help them find a safe haven. It has starved the population and killed and maimed and obstructed those who could have provided them with food and help. It has committed atrocities and attacked those documented and reporting on them, including today by shooting in the neck an Al Jazeera journalist, Fadi al-Wahidi, in Jabalia refugee camp where massacres are ongoing. This is genocide. And you must make sure that nothing you do, nothing you say enables that genocide. And you must act to stop it as council, as states in your national capacity, and as international community. We denounce complicity and we denounce complacency and we denounce self-inflicted powerlessness. More and more countries are calling for an arms embargo. to make sure not to provide Israel with weapons it could use against the civilian population. If you are calling for a ceasefire, you don't feed the fire by sending weapons and ammunition. More and more countries are calling for accountability against perpetrators of crimes to prevent their reoccurrence. If you call yourself a champion of international law, you do not help shield perpetrators of atrocities. Madam President, Israel could have ended the genocide in Gaza, and this would have prevented any further escalation. Instead, it is widening its killing, destruction, and forcible displacement spree in the West Bank and in Lebanon. The Israeli Prime Minister warned Lebanon from falling in the abyss of destruction and suffering like Gaza, an abyss he created in Gaza through genocide and is recreating in Lebanon, killing 2,000 Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians, and displacing over 1 million in less than a month. We are watching the same failings in stopping Israeli atrocities in Palestine repeat themselves in Lebanon. Is our blood cheap? Are our civilians less worthy of protection? Are our lives less sacred? What else could explain that Israel for a whole year has gotten away with murder and keeps extending the scope of suffering and loss without being stopped? Because you are not acting either as a group or in your national capacity, some of you. Did you grow accustomed to our death? Did you grow accustomed to see entire neighborhoods flattened on the heads of their inhabitants, children, women, men, elderly? This is now the new normal. Did you get accustomed to see the Israeli Prime Minister ignoring and insulting the world and still expecting its support? Still expecting your weapons, your trade, your relations to serve his colonial agenda? Israel must be stopped. It cannot have a veto right over the ceasefire, or there will be no ceasefire. The Israeli government does not care about Palestinian lives, or Lebanese lives, or even Israeli lives. It is creating insecurity for a century. Israel will protect its occupation and domination at any cost, and Netanyahu will protect Netanyahu at any cost. Civilians are the ones paying the price. We want international law to prevail, freedom to prevail, justice to prevail, peace to prevail. We want all civilians not to be harmed. There cannot be a right to commit atrocities under any pretext or any justification. If you are a firefighter, you do not negotiate with the arsonist. You prevent him from spreading the fire. The fire is now threatening to engulf our entire region. Stop the arsonist. Do you have the backbone, collectively or in your national capacity, to stop the arsonists? You know his name, his address, his methods, his lies, his goals. And yet, he feels he can continue spreading fire in total impunity while the whole world tries to figure out how you stop the fire if you are not willing to stop the arsonists. It takes him seconds to destroy and it takes us all years to rebuild, decades to rebuild, and the reality is once the fire has started, nothing is ever the same. Hear the screams of those enduring the fire in their flesh, and tell us how to explain to them that for 365 days, the world has watched the 365 kilometers square of Gaza turned into rubble and ashes. The outrage your countries displayed, the solidarity they demonstrated every single day in the streets, needs to turn into an unstoppable wave to put out the fire. If we do not, everything else we are trying to do and say in this chamber will be meaningless.
Je remercie l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine. Je donne la parole maintenant au représentant d'Israël.
I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I would like to address Mr. Mansour's words about Resolution 2735. You haven't mentioned an important sentence about the release of the hostages. That's why we are sitting in this room, because that's what started the war, is the kidnapping of Israeli civilians. And I'm really disappointed, Mr. Mansour, not from Hamas. We had no expectations from Hamas, but from you and from the Palestinian Authority.
Est-ce que je peux répéter ce que j'ai dit en
Could I
entame
repeat
de
what I
cette
said at the
séance,
beginning of the
que le
meeting,
Conseil de
please, that
sécurité est
the
un lieu de
Security
respect
Council
et je
is a
prie
place
tous
of
les
respect, and I call upon all speakers, all speakers, to respect appropriate standards in terms of time, choice of words and content in their remarks, and we don't interrupt each other. Thank you. I ask you to continue.
And I'm disappointed not from the Hamas. We have no expectations from Hamas. We know they are savages. But the Palestinian Authority, you are the moderate, the educated, and you are not capable after a year to say we condemn the atrocities of October 7th, we condemn Hamas, and it makes us wonder about the future, about ideas, but you are not able to say that. Neither President Abbas in the General Assembly, not one word. And Israelis are watching us. You mentioned the Palestinians, but also Israelis are watching us, and they're asking themselves, is there a difference between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority? When 70% of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria support the atrocities of October 7th? And I think that, yes, we want to see a day when there will be peace. But for that to happen, you have to make a distinction between evil and good, and you don't do that, Mr. Mansour. Madam President, it has now been 1 year since the darkest day in Israel's history, the October 7 massacre, a day when innocent lives were brutally taken, a day that scarred an entire nation. Over the past year, Israel has endured unimaginable pain. Families continue to grieve, not only for those they lost, but for those who remain in the grip of Hamas, held as hostages in Gaza. I would like to thank the Council members who joined us on Monday for the commemoration of this horrific event. At that event, you heard the heart-wrenching stories of the families of the victims. You listened to a mother who was here at the UN. She told the story about her 2 daughters who were murdered at the Nova Music Festival. She will never walk her daughters down the aisle, never again feel their warm embrace. You heard a story from a rabbi whose son's body is still held by Hamas's terrorists. He endured over 160 days of not knowing whether his son is alive, and he shared with us that his wife felt a sense of relief from the news of his death, because she told him that at least the pain was now only theirs to experience. Then we heard from a Muslim, Bedouin Israeli, who shared his horrid experience with a brother who remains a living hostage in the Hamas terror dungeons. And it's not only Jews. You have Christians, Muslims, not only Israelis that are being held today by Hamas. In these stories, you saw the full extent of Hamas's depravity, a terror organization that makes no distinctions. They do not care about age, religion, or nationality. Their mission is singular, to murder everyone. Colleagues, some of you in this chamber support Israel's firm position that Hamas cannot remain in the ruling regime in Gaza. Others remain in the middle, indifferent. And tragically, some even offer their support to Hamas and its murderous objectives. However, if any of the Council members want these discussions to be productive, to reap any sort of benefit, every conversation should center around the simple truth. The future of Gaza must be a future without Hamas. We can discuss other options, but we have to agree about that. And I want you, Mr. Mansour, to discuss this idea and acknowledge that no future for Gaza if Hamas is there. We know what happened to your colleagues from the PA when they were ruling Gaza when Hamas took over. We know why you and President Abbas haven't visited Gaza for more than a decade, because you know what will happen to you there. We must start to envision Gaza freed from the clenched grip of terror. What would it look like? How would it work? How could Gaza thrive when it is free of this destructive regime? I, myself, and many Israelis, we have a vision for Gaza without Hamas. Aid would finally reach those who truly need it. You spoke about the aid. Do you know that in one day, about 50% of the trucks were hijacked by Hamas? I haven't heard that from the distinguished reporters we heard today. 50%, not one or two trucks, 50% being hijacked. In the future, the trucks carrying that aid would no longer be violently hijacked. Money intended for civilian welfare would not be diverted by terrorists. The money being donated would be poured into schools and hospitals, not weapons. The fuel sent to Gaza would be used in homes for cooking, not for launching rockets. Concrete would be used to build highways, not terror tunnels. Hamas has exploited the suffering of its people, using the misery in Gaza as a propaganda tool where they line their pockets and boost their arsenals. Our vision of Gaza is not an impossible dream. It is within reach. But it cannot happen while Hamas remains in control, diverting aid, exploiting resources, and worsening the suffering of their own people. On October 7 this year, 2 days ago, Hamas fired several rockets into civilian areas in Israel. The fact that this fight is not over, unfortunately. The Israel Defense Forces will continue to operate until all the objectives of this war are met, until Hamas's military capabilities are dismantled and all our hostages returned. Madam President, despite the ongoing threats from 7 fronts, despite the unspeakable atrocities committed against our people, Israel's humanitarian efforts in Gaza have been nothing short of extraordinary. The facts are clear. Over 52,000 trucks have entered Gaza under Israeli coordination, delivering more than 1 million tons of aid, 700,000 tons of it being food. Israel imposes no restrictions on humanitarian aid. In fact, 82% of all requests for humanitarian coordination have been approved and implemented. Our humanitarian coordination covers a broad range of needs as they arise. And yes, we work with UN agencies. We have worked closely with global partners like WHO and UNICEF to vaccinate over 500,000 Gazan children against polio in a matter of weeks. The second stage of the vaccination campaign is commencing next week. This is a cooperation we strive for with our partners, we are willing and able to work on the ground. Additionally, we have expanded the El Mawasi humanitarian area, both inside and facilities, with an increased supply of food, water, and medical equipment. Now, compare our efforts to the failures of UNRWA. While Israel cooperates with international organizations like WHO and UNICEF to improve the lives of civilians, UNRWA Gaza has allowed Hamas to infiltrate its ranks. This infiltration is so ingrained, so institutional, that the organization is simply beyond repair. The contrast could not be clearer. While Israel fights to protect and uplift civilians, UNRWA's leave them and allow them to suffer. Israel has been warning for months about the infiltration of Hamas into UNRWA, yet not significant action has been taken. And I haven't heard the distinguished gentleman from UNRWA, when he spoke about the casualties, how many of them were affiliated with Hamas. We gave the names to UNRWA. The recent revelation that Fatah Sharif, Hamas's commander in Lebanon this time, he was also an UNRWA school principal, believe it or not, a principal, and he was the head of its teachers' union, the head of Hamas in Lebanon. That's beyond imagination. This is not merely a failure of oversight. This is the absurd reality we are facing. An organization that claims to provide education and humanitarian aid has been infiltrated to the point where terrorists are running classrooms, indoctrinating future generations, and hiding in plain sight under the banner of the United Nations. Distinguished Council members, we have debated this issue in circles for months, to no avail. The focus of these discussions must shift from the symptoms to the disease itself, the Islamic regime of Iran. Today, we discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Tomorrow, we will have a discussion about Lebanon. What will be next? Yemen? Iraq? We all know the true cause of the suffering, Tehran's desire for supremacist expansion. Iran's aggression continues unrestricted. Just last week, Iran launched hundreds of missiles in the largest ballistic attack in history. In history. No state in the world would tolerate such assaults on its people, and Israel will not tolerate it either. We will choose when and where our response takes place. It will be decisive, and we will not hesitate to defend ourselves. 1 year has passed since the October 7 massacre. 1 year of pain, mourning, and resilience. Yet, what have we learned in that time? Have we truly confronted the evil that seeks to destroy us? Or are we still debating, still pointing fingers? And I agree with you, Mr. Mansour. We come here, you blame Israel, we blame you. I agree with you. While the origin of all this suffering, the real evil, Hamas, Hezbollah, and their puppet masters in Tehran, continue to sow terror and death. This body must move beyond the surface and address the deeper disease that has plagued the region for far too long. Words alone will not end the situation in Gaza or anywhere else. Only decisive collective action can root out the terrorists and bring about a future of peace and security for all. Israel will not wait. We will defend our people, our land, and our future. We stand as guardians of the very principles that this body was built to protect. It has been 1 year since the massacre of October 7. We cannot afford another. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant d'Israël et je passe la parole au représentant de la Mauritanie.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to thank OCHA and UNRWA for the briefings. I thank Algeria and Slovenia for calling for this meeting.
بدأت إسرائيل حربا انتقامية ضد المدنيين من سكان قطاع غزة.
Israel launched a vengeance war against the people of Gaza,
استخدمت بها
an
أكثر
untraditional
الوسائل لا
genocidal war
أخلاقية
where
ولا
it used the
إنسانية
most
من
immoral and
أجل ضمان
inhumane of
بناء سكان
tactics
القطاع
to obliterate the
وهو
people
ما
of the Gaza
تأكد مع
Strip.
خطابات الرسميين
This has been
الإسرائيليين
confirmed in
التي
statements
رفعت
by
شعارات
Israeli
لا
officials
كهرباء
that repeated the
لا
slogan,
طعام
no
لا
electricity,
ماء
no
لا
food,
وقود
no water,
لسكان
no
القطاع
fuel for the
لتصل
people
إلى
of
وصفهم
Gaza.
بالحيوانات البشرية
They even
ثم
went so
الدعوة
far
إلى
as to call
استخدام
them
السلاح النووي
human
ضدهم
animals and then
وبالفعل
called for using
فقد
nuclear
نفذت
weapons
إسرائيل
against them.
تهديداتها
And
وبدأت
indeed,
في
Israel
أكتوبر من
followed
العام
through with
الماضي
these threats
حرب
and
إبادة
started
غير
in
مسبوقة
October of last
وها
year
هي
an
النتائج
unprecedented
ماثلة أمامنا
genocidal
اليوم.
war. Here are the
لقد تعرض
results.
سكان القطاع
The
البالغ
people of
عددهم
Gaza,
حدود 2.3 مليون
2.3 million
والمحاصرين
people,
في رقعة لا تتجاوز
besieged
365
in a piece of
كيلومتر
land
مربع
whose area is no
بالقصف
more than
المركز طيلة عام
365 square
كامل وفي
kilometers,
سابقة
have been
في هذا القرن
subjected to
بما
intense
مجموعه
bombardment
70,000 طن
over a whole
من
year.
القنابل
70,000
مما خلف
tons of bombs have been
42,000
dropped, which
شهيدا
is unparalleled in
و100,000
this
جريح
century.
و10,000
This claimed the lives of
مفقودين
42,000 martyrs and
المشردين
injured
أغلبهم من النساء
100,000.
والأطفال
Tens of thousands are
بالإضافة
missing,
إلى
hundreds of
خسائر
thousands are
بالمئات
displaced.
في
Most of them
أرواح
are women and
المسعفين
children.
عمال وكالات
Hundreds
الإنقاذ
of paramedics,
الأطباء
rescue workers,
والصحفيين
doctors,
وعمال
journalists,
الأمم
and
المتحدة
UN staff lost their
ينضاف
lives.
إلى ذلك الخسائر في البنية التحتية
There
الحيوية
has been significant damage to
ودور
civilian
العبادة
infrastructure, schools,
والمستشفيات
places of worship,
باختصار
hospitals.
لقد تحول
In
قطاع
sum,
غزة في 12 شهرا
over
الماضية
the past
إلى
12
ركام
months,
ومقبرة
the
جماعية
Gaza Strip
على مرأى
has turned
ومسمع
into
العالم
rubble, a mass grave, in full
وتؤكد
view of the
المجموعة
world.
على ضرورة التحرك
group
الفوري قبل فوت الأوان
Stresses the need
حيث
to act
نقدر
immediately
في
before it's
هذا
too late.
سياق
In this context,
الجهود
we
الحثيثة التي
value
تبذلها
the
جمهورية
tireless
مصر
efforts
العربية والدولة
by
قطر
the Arab
من
Republic of
أجل
Egypt and the
التوصل
State of
إلى
Qatar
اتفاق
to reach a
لوقف إطلاق
ceasefire
النار
agreement and to
وتخفيف
alleviate
المعاناة في
the
غزة.
suffering in Gaza.
ورغم هذه المعاناة
Despite
والواقع
this
المؤلم
suffering and the
يواصل
painful
مجلس الأمن
reality,
الفشل
the
في
Security
فرض
Council
وقف
is
إطلاق
still
النار
failing to
أحرى
impose a
محاسبة
ceasefire,
إسرائيل القوة المحتلة
failing to
على
hold
جرائمها
Israel, the
بحق
occupying
المدنيين
power,
العزل
accountable for
وهو
its crimes
فشل
against
زائد من
defenseless
سوء الوضع
civilians.
على
This
الأرض
failure
حيث
worsened the
تضافر
situation on the
الجوع
ground.
وانعدام
Hunger,
الخدمات
lack of
الأساسية
basic
مع
services,
آلة الحرب الإسرائيلية
and the Israeli
ليحيل
war
الحياة إلى
machine
جحيم
created the
في
perfect
قطاع غزة.
combination for life to be
لكن
turned
فشل
into hell in
وضع
Gaza.
الكثير من الأسئلة حول
This
فعالية
is a
مجلس
failure
الأمن
that raised a number of
وجدوائيته
questions on the
كضامن
effectiveness
للأمن
of the Security
والاستقرار
Council
الدولي
and its
في الوقت
relevance
الذي
as a
يقف
guarantor
عاجزا
for
عن
international
وقف
peace and
حرب
security,
إبادة دامت
as
عاما
it
كاملا
is still
وما زالت
unable to
متواصلة.
stop a war that has been
وبالتوازي
raging
مع
for a
هذا
year and is
الفشل
still
تواصل
ongoing.
إسرائيل
In parallel to
الاستفادة
this
من الدعم
failure, Israel
اللامحدود
continues to
سياسيا
benefit from
وعسكريا
unlimited
من
political and
الدول
military
الحليفة
support
التي
from
تزودها
allies
بالسلاح
that provides
والعتاد
it with
على
arms and
رغم من
equipment.
الدعوات المتصاعدة
Despite
والهادفة
increasing
إلى حظر
calls
تسليحها
to
بوصفها
ban
قوة
arming
الاحتلال
Israel as
بما
it
في
is the
ذلك قرار
occupying
الدور
power,
الاستثنائي الطارئ
including in the
العاشر
resolution of the 10th
للجمعية
Emergency
المتحدة
Special
حول
Session of the
فلسطين
General
في
Assembly on
اجتماعها المعقد
Palestine
يوم 18 سبتمبر 2024
held on the
وذلك
18th of
بعد
September
فتوى محكمة العدل الدولي
2024
بشأن
following
الآثار القانونية
the
الناجمة عن سياسة
advisory
إسرائيل
opinion of the ICJ on the
وممارستها
legal
في
consequences
فلسطين
arising from
بتاريخ
Israel's
19 يوليو
policies and practices in
2024
Palestine
والتي
issued
نصت
on
من
the
خلالها المحكمة
19th
على
of July
ضرورة إنهاء الوجود
2024. The
الإسرائيلي
ICJ
غير
declared the
القانوني
need
في
to end
الأراضي
the
الفلسطينية
unlawful
المحتلة
Israeli
بما
presence
فيها
in the occupied
القدس
Palestinian
الشرقية
territories,
وذلك
including
في أقرب
East
الآجال
Jerusalem, as soon as
وتدين
possible. The Arab group condemns in the strongest terms the repeated Israeli aggression on Syrian territories. In the past few days, it hit residential buildings, leading to civilian casualties, including women and children. The Arab group reiterates the need to take immediate measures to deter the occupation entity from pursuing a criminal approach based on killing innocent people, spreading destruction and chaos, and threatening peace and security in the region. Measures must be taken to ensure accountability for these crimes. The Arab group reiterates the need to implement relevant United Nations resolutions to end the Israeli occupation of Arab territories in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, it is time to take all possible measures in full consonance with the principles and rules of international law to end the genocidal war that is entering its second year, to save whoever is left of the people of Gaza, to save what is left of the credibility of this Council and the United Nations as a whole. Otherwise, this war, which is already spilling over to include all countries of the region, including Syria and Lebanon, will become a full-out war that will ravage the region and the whole world as a result of the intransigence and arrogance of the extremist government of Netanyahu, which continues to drag the region into complete chaos, continues to destabilize international peace and security to satisfy its bloody, chauvinistic aspirations. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de Mauritanie et je passe la parole au représentant de Turquie.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Algeria and Slovenia for requesting this timely meeting, as well as Commissioner General Lazzarini and OCHA Director Dalton for their briefings. We appreciate the invaluable leadership of Commissioner General Lazzarini and his unwavering commitment to the humanitarian work under these direst conditions. As the chair of the working group on the financing of UNRWA, Turkey extends its deepest gratitude to all council members who stood in support of UNRWA today. I also want to honor the memory of the brave UNRWA staff who lost their lives in Gaza, making the ultimate sacrifice in their honorable mission. Over 226 UNRWA personnel have been brutally killed in Gaza, and more than 200 UNRWA facilities have been damaged. Severe restrictions on the agency's operations have made it nearly impossible to fulfill its mandate. Furthermore, UNRWA has been subjected to an ill-intended and politically motivated defamation campaign that has worsened its financial strain. Madam President, let's be clear. UNRWA, with its mandate, functions, institutional structure, and over 70 years of experience supporting Palestinian refugees on the ground, is simply irreplaceable. We must not forget that UNRWA is not only a vital humanitarian agency, but also a stabilizing force in the region. Diplomats who served in the region know this very well. Since October 7, the agency has been the backbone of humanitarian operations in Gaza. For 75 years, it has played a crucial role in providing essential services and emergency aid to approximately 6 million Palestinian refugees in Gaza, West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Attacks on UNRWA pose serious implications for international peace and security. The agency exists because a political solution does not yet. Therefore, it is imperative that the Security Council acts swiftly to protect UNRWA amid these unprecedented attacks on all fronts. We also call on all member states to scale up their contributions to the organization. This year, Turkey donated an additional $2 million to UNRWA, in addition to our voluntary contribution of $10 million and other aids. Madam President, the bills in Knesset to designate UNRWA as a terrorist organization, to revoke UNRWA's privileges and immunities, to prohibit UNRWA's operations, contravene Israel's legal obligations under the UN Charter, the Convention on UN Privileges and Immunities, the International Court of Justice provisional rulings regarding genocide case, the General Assembly's mandate for UNRWA, and various other international legal